I'm very happy to be introducing Bishakh Som. Because very few comics or artworks fall in your hands and you're instantly mesmerized by it. Som's work is, I think that it's got that power because it's honest, it's genuine, and above all, it's fearless. She's had many lives before becoming a comic artist. She was born in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and she moved to, well, her family moved to New York City when she was 6 years old, and she's lived in New York City since then. She studied biology at Cornell, and then she studied architecture at Harvard, and she's been working as an architect for almost her whole life before becoming a comic artist. But I'm happy that you decided to become a comic artist because, like, you kind of answered the call, as Stacy was saying yesterday, and she's become an amazing author. Her pieces conflate the tools of architectural representation with those of sequential narrative in order to question these very methods and offer new means of representing space, time, and the role of the body in both simultaneously. In her memoir, Spellbound, she masterfully depicts the everyday life, the time that passes slow, the ennui, and the anxieties of a novel creator. Scenes of Gender depict personal experiences as a trans femme person of color in New York City and abroad. They are wonderful vignettes that depict how global sociopolitical dynamics manifest itself in the local use of urban space, but more importantly, how individuals and communities resist, challenge, and redesign them. In Apsara Engine, she imagines, invents, draws, manifests new paths, new itineraries, and new ways to live and to be for all sorts of characters, be it racialized, transgender, cisgender characters, or creatures like flying pets with human heads. Apsara Engine uses the discontinuous visual grammar of comics to actively reframe both histories of erasure and the hypervisibilization of racialized and queer bodies to change the shape of violent and unequal cities through the interpretive strategies of their architectural form. Everything is possible because Bishakh Som's work dares to go beyond any form of imposed or perceived limitations, and that's what I love about it. I just mentioned 3 of her works, all different, but there are many more, and her panels and illustrations have appeared in The New Yorker, Vice, The Huffington Post, We're Still Here, the first all-trans comics anthology, and many other media and publications. Her artwork was featured in Animal Magic, a solo show of watercolors at Art Lexis Gallery in Brooklyn, and numerous group shows like The Graphic Canon, World Literature Through Art and Comics at Grady Alexis Gallery, Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream at the Society of Illustrators, both in New York, and The Unusual Aspects in the Netherlands. She received the Sherry Grant in 2003 for her comics collection Angel, which you can check on her website. Actually, I recommend you to go to the website because it's fantastic. Her graphic novel, Apsara Engine, is the winner of 2021 LA Times Book Prize for Best Graphic Novel, and a 2021 Lambda Literary Award winner for Best LGBTQ Comics. Her graphic memoir, Spellbound, was also a 2021 Lambda Literary Award finalist. And all these awards and acknowledgements are just the beginning. Please join me in welcoming Bishakh Som.
Thank you. Gracias, Esther. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great honor. Can everyone hear me okay? And I want to thank University of Iowa, Esther, Anna, Corey, Rachel, Aaron, and everyone else for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here in person, and yeah, not to have you all in a space together physically. When I set out to come here to Iowa, and I was checking in for my flight at JF LaGuardia in New York, I used one of those self-service check-in kiosks to check into my flight. And there was a very kind United employee who was sort of near me, sort of standing behind the kiosk, making sure that I knew what I was doing. And so I was just like, scan my passport, put in the airport code for New York, and then I think it was when I put in the airport code for O'Hare, which is ORD, that she looked at me and she said, this ain't your first rodeo, is it? And I was like, I've never been to a rodeo, but I got her meaning, and what she, I think, was saying to me was that you've clearly traveled before. You're used to the sort of language of travel, which I thought was a very nice prelude to my journey from New York to Iowa, but also a prelude to what I'm about to talk to you about, which is my history of travel and how travel, not only across physical borders, but across borders of gender and culture, have shaped my life and my work. How I came to realize that this idea of travel and migration has influenced me and made me who I am, both as a sort of gendered person and an artist. This is also kind of an inheritance that I've gotten from my folks and from their ancestors as people from South Asia who eventually ended up, constituting a South Asian diaspora. So just to give you a sort of background, as Esther was pointing out, my parents were of South Asian origins, specifically they're Bengali. And I guess I should say, like anybody who is of a certain generation now or has been claiming South Asian ancestry, I think, I mean, I can get pushback on this if you want, but I think that inherently contains, that identity contains within it an inherent displacement, thanks to, the way the South Asian subcontinent has been divided up, specifically the partition of India, the kinds of turmoil that led to. There's a history of displacement that is built into being from this part of the world, right? So, and this is something I'm going to talk about a little bit, about how that inheritance is part and parcel of who we are as people of the South Asian diaspora. My dad was, he worked with the UN, and he was a statistician. He studied demographics, and my mom was also affiliated with the UN. They grew up in what is now Bangladesh, but was, when they were growing up, was part of India. So in the top right-hand corner, you can see my dad was from this area called Sylhet, and my mom was from an area closer or further west called Pabna. And all of this is part of what was once Bengal, right? But was then carved up. First, Bangladesh became East Pakistan. There was a migration of people, I mean, probably a lot of you already know this, but migration of people who are, it was carved up on geographic and religious lines, right? So there's a movement of Muslims towards East Pakistan and Pakistan, a movement of Hindus towards India, and my parents, I think they had by this point moved to Kolkata, which you see further down in the corner there, which was part of India. So they somewhat escaped that trauma of migration, but also lived with it because it was part and parcel of everyone's sort of culture at the time, right? But so within that small movement from Sylhet and Pabna to Kolkata, there's already displacement built in, even before. It seems like that history is always with us, right? No matter how you cut it. Since my dad was worked with the UN, he was stationed in Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia. So, yet again, another sort of movement, a movement through geography, and another displacement for us. By the way, these are images from my memoir, Spellbound. I was born there, and we lived. I still kind of can't believe this is true, but we lived across from Emperor Haile Selassie. It seems kind of absurd and magical. It's like, oh yes, Gandalf is my next door neighbor, or whatever, So I never really knew India as a child. We would go back every couple of years, but Addis was my home. It was more familiar to me in terms of sensory kind of attachments. I remember like going to India and being like, where am I? This place is very foreign to me because I miss the sort of smells and sounds of Addis, right? So just being this initial displacement for me, I think set the tone for a lot of displacements in my life, right? So yeah, that's little me. That's my mom holding me and my cousins. And I think about this image because I think about inheritance, right? And I think about the way, I mean, I'll talk about this a little later, but like the way in which I've been approaching them physically and aesthetically in my life, right? It was sort of an attempt to grasp what home means. And I think this is another theme of the sort of work that I'm going to show, is a sort of oscillation between grasping at the idea of home and belonging, and also at the same time immersing yourself in this idea of migration and displacement as a sort of inherent quality to one's life that you can't ignore or that you can't contradict or try to overcome, because it's just always with you. My aunt, who's in the picture on the right, that's my dad, also, like a lot of people from, from the South Asian diaspora, was also displaced, but through her own volition, she came to Johns Hopkins to study and was in the States ever since. There's a sort of history you can see that of oscillations between displacement and home that have always been part of my family. So that's where I'm seeing the sort of idea of inheritance coming into play. So yeah, we moved in 1974. We moved to New York City because of sort of political upheavals in Ethiopia. My dad was restationed in New York at the UN headquarters there, and that's pretty much where I grew up. So yet another displacement and movement away from a kind of sense of stability, of identity. And I think this, again, sets the tone for the rest of my life, a constant sort of movement. These are, actually I didn't want to show the Tintin, but to sort of come back to home in on comics for a second, I started drawing comics when I entered, I was enrolled at the United Nations School, which after all this movement and upheaval seemed to me like I was finally finding a sense of stability and grounding, right? And to me, being with kids from all over the place, I guess the United Nations was sort of the closest thing I had to a sense of home and grounding, right? So to be at the school with kids from Ghana, Kenya, Mexico, Ireland, Spain, Kuwait, that felt like home to me, and I felt like, okay, this is maybe the magic of New York. Maybe this is the magic of the UN. This is maybe a return to a sort of sense of grounding. I think part of that grounding came out in the sort of natural tendency that we had as kids to draw comics, right? So there was a bunch of us who started drawing comics on like sheets of newsprint. We just very naturally divided them up into squares, invented characters, populated these pages with these silly characters, and just had, the whole thing was very organic. And I think comics is sort of, it's very strange to me that it comes so naturally to children. And I wonder what that says about the combination of image and text that is so, that defies either one separately, that becomes part of our language as people who develop cognition in certain ways, right? So I did comics with 3 other friends. They stopped doing comics, but somehow this is a language that I stuck to and embraced and kept and nurtured me pretty much my whole life. And I think that to some degree this is down to my folks. I don't know why they, again, I think it's part of the sort of natural evolution of children of a certain generation that, and I'm not sure, maybe it's more to do with like Indian kids or, South Asian kids. We were brought up, kids of my generation with, and every Indian kid read these, right? So Tintin was a huge influence for us, Tintin. I'm not going to go into how problematic Tintin is right now, but y'all know the issues there. I bring up Tintin because not to praise Hergé or to praise the book, but because this is what I grew up with. This is the visual language that informed me as a developing person. The second thing, sort of point of reference that my parents brought to me as a developing person, so thanks Mom and Dad, was this series of comics published by Amar Chitrakota, which is an Indian imprint that focuses on comics that tells stories of Indian mythology, culture, folklore, politics through comics, right? Also deeply problematic. And I'll just briefly touch on why most of the heroes of these stories tend to be, there's a focus on caste, which is inevitable and like inescapable, right? They tend to be higher caste heroes who are plucked from history that they focus on. So-called lower castes are not part of the history and mythology of this particular format. They're also very focused on Hindu stories as opposed to other kinds of stories, to the detriment of the long history of Muslim contributions to Indian and South Asian culture. And yeah, there's a huge problem with like, and this is prevalent throughout South Asia, skin color. All the heroes and heroines tend to be very light-skinned, even if they weren't in real life. And yeah, there's a sort of, it's very troublesome, but again, this is the visual language I was brought up with, that this is how I learned about a lot of history, but also it's stuff that I push back on as a maturing person. And the third, maybe not so problematic, but we can talk about that too, is Archie. And again, this is all, these are all things that we read as Indian kids, but this also informed to some degree my language, visual language, and my appreciation of how comics worked. Although, I didn't really so much care about Archie and Reggie as I did about Betty and Veronica, which goes to tell you something about who I eventually became. So yeah, I said I stuck with comics. These are some very early adolescent comics that I did, which are all very, once I grew out of like trying to emulate my Marvel kind of, the heroes that I read in Marvel Comics, I started to like adopt more of an indie sensibility, even though I kind of didn't know what indie comics were. So these was just like really sensitive, airy-fairy stories about kids in record stores being mopey and sensitive. I think a lot of that was influenced by music, particularly, the sort of alternative music of the time of the 80s, like the dreaded Smiths and Kate Bush and stuff like this.
That is so dope.
I mean, yeah, big thumbs down to Morrissey. Again, very problematic, right? All these influences that we grew up with that then turn out to be quite horrific, right? Later on in college, I was part of a collective of people who got together, and we started doing an anthology called High Horse. Esther mentioned that I studied biology briefly. I also studied interior design at Cornell, and this, again, was a sort of movement away from who I thought I was, right? Because I really, in my heart of hearts, wanted to be an artist, but I was sort of shunted away from that by cultural expectations, right? And as you know, this is also an inheritance. Like, there's this sort of stereotype of South Asian kids being bullied into becoming doctors or lawyers or engineers, right? I lived that, and I found a way out of it. I like sort of squirmed my way out of it by proposing that I should, that I couldn't hack being a doctor, but that I would pursue architecture instead, and that seemed to be somewhat acceptable to my folks. So that's the path that I took. But again, there's a sort of displacement between who I thought I could be and what I ended up doing. So it's a constant sort of veering away from what I consider to be an essence, even though that in itself seems sort of an illusory idea, right? So while this was happening, I was also studying architecture, and this was, to me, a movement away, but also, I think, there were visual signifiers in architecture that I'm glad I could adopt at the time. And you'll see in my later work how architecture and architectural representation comes back into the way that I think about comics, right? And the page and the art and act of drawing, how those all combine to me was, even though I've given up architecture as a practice, I think as a mode of representation has always stayed with me. And for that, I'm glad, even though the field itself turned out to be quite toxic for me, and it's something I had to bail from, I tried during this time in academia to combine comics and architecture with varying degrees of success. This is something I did in Cambridge when I did a semester abroad there, where I thought my colleagues, my friends were like, you should do a comic about this project that you're designing. So instead of just doing, drawing elevations and plans and stuff of the building, which I did too, I invented a narrative that took place within the building that I was proposing, and I invented these two characters who sort of inhabit and walk through the building as if you're having a walkthrough, an animated walkthrough within the building. I thought it was quite innovative, but like I think as a visual language, it was kind of jarring for the professors who hadn't seen this kind of thing before, so it didn't land very well. Nevertheless, I didn't let it discourage me. I just went on to do even more kind of horrible stuff in my professional work, which was probably the most of a displacement I've ever felt in my career. I was used to the idea of being a South Asian person in New York, having lived all these sort of lives, in and out of India, in Ethiopia, now in New York. But working in architecture really was very jarring for me, even though I did it for quite a while. This is the kind of work I did. So I did a lot of like 3D models of buildings that then eventually became renderings that were used as design tools and presentation tools as well. But, in the spirit of not regretting things, I think I learned a lot about form and space and volume, and rendering, drawing these kinds of spaces that has stayed with me in my comics work. So yeah, I think, this is why I don't shy away from drawing what, other people call backgrounds. I sort of embrace it as a sort of, I take on the challenge of drawing a space and inhabiting it with people, or the other way around, having people having the space be as integral to the space of comics as the people are. This is, I think, something I took away from architecture, however much it damaged me. This is an image from Spellbound, and it sort of recreates with some embellishments the moment at which there was a rupture in my professional practice. So it's simultaneously a displacement from where I was and finally a movement back towards who I thought I could be. My boss, I won't go into it too much, but he basically sabotaged the office, and it was just beginning to implode when I told him I'd had enough, and I just got out of there. And that's when I realized I had the time, space, and means to do what I really wanted, and I finally found a way to ground myself, to go back to a sense of belonging, and approaching home, which to me was working finally on drawing comics as a serious endeavor and working on a graphic novel, which turned out to be Apsara Engine in the end. Around the same time, because nothing is ever like constant, there was more displacement in my life when my mom got ill. She developed Alzheimer's, and we had to move her back from New York to Kolkata, to India, where she could get the help that she needed, the round-the-clock care that she needed. So back and forth, right? There's this constant oscillation, which seems to be almost like baked into the genes of my family, but not only my family, a lot of the South Asian diaspora, right? The sort of cultural and racial given that we as Asian Americans have to contend with by the very nature of being Asian Americans and of being part of any diaspora. I think there was a turning point finally when my mom died, and not long after that, Dad died. And finally, in a sort of strange irony, the family that had always, to me, represented the closest thing to home was gone. And then that's a moment I dreaded all my life, but I guess the irony is that it allowed me both as an artist, a burgeoning artist, and a person who is unaware of their sexuality or gender, to finally come to a realization about myself, because that burden was gone. The sort of cultural expectations and familial expectations that you place on children to conform. You know, I escaped it once when I got out of biology and being a doctor, and then the second escape came after they, as my sort of guardians, like kind of the super ego that was finally sort of lifted from me at that moment of the ultimate displacement, came to me as a moment of horror, but also of liberation. I started to realize a lot of things about myself at that point, and it's around then when I had the space to come out to myself as a trans person. And simultaneously, I actually want to show you, there were things I was realizing about myself as well in terms of culture and identity. And I think this was in reaction to my parents no longer being part of my life, but I started like wanting, we'll talk about this a little more, like wanting to recapture a sense of who I was in terms of my culture. And I was sort of approaching it very, I was grasping at straws a little bit, but I want to show you, I started doing, these are pieces that are from the website Autostraddle that I do some articles for. At this time, I sort of refound myself as a South Asian person. And I think, again, it was because of the sense of loss that I wanted to reground myself in who I was, and I started like, you know, reinventing myself as a person of color who hadn't quite dealt with who they are specifically. So I started, you know, reinventing myself as my mom a little bit, which sounds crazy, but it was a way for me to reconnect with this vanished culture that I had lost, right? So I started wearing like South Asian garb, doing my hair in a braid, and like embracing that side of myself, which was lost to me. I'd never gotten to explore that in my life, right? So I wanted to kind of recapture it, which led to some sort of hilarious misreadings as a trans person, right? So this is depicting a moment when I was in Manhattan after a meeting with my publishers, or soon-to-be publishers, when I would go down to the what is called Little India in Manhattan, and to pick up vegetables and spices and stuff. And this is when I was pretty much just come out as a trans person, so I was quite sensitive to how I looked, like going back to the theme of this seminar, how I look to other people. There's a question of passing and not passing, which I won't get into right now. But so I went to this store where I was buying some supplies and stuff, very aware of this, the owner of the store, like, who knew me, sort of, but was, you know, whether or not he would clock me as a trans person. So I was just being like very kind of subdued. Once I got up to the counter, he's still like looking at me, and I'm like, oh no, he's going to say something about my gender, or like, you know, what I thought I was doing dressed up in this way. And he's still like scrutinizing me, and then he finally says to me, you know, and when I think he's going to say something like, you know, are you a man or a woman? Instead he says, are you Pakistani? And I said, well, no. I was so like, you know, taken aback. And I was like, no, I'm Bengali. And the two of them are flabbergasted. They're like, Bengali? And it's like this weird misreading that I really didn't expect, that only happened at the confluence of culture and gender. Luckily for me, it was an unthreatening moment of reckoning, but it was also like, yeah, it was. I got out of there not knowing how closely I had escaped a sort of reading that I did not want to happen. And then this is another moment when I was walking to the bank in the rain in Park Slope in Brooklyn, and this South Asian woman just sort of inserted herself under my umbrella and started talking to me. And I was like, oh, okay, yes, please, share my umbrella. And she just starts asking me about my life. And she's like, are you married? And I'm like, yes. And she's like, how many children? And I'm like, I didn't want to tell her my children were furry because she wouldn't have understood that. But anyway, I was like, no children. And she says this to me, your husband doesn't want children? And I'm like, husband, oh God. And again, a sort of misreading, but also, I hesitate to call it a misreading because there's a question of whether I think she thought I was cis, right? So there's the question of passing again, but also the misreading that I had to lead a certain kind of life that wasn't in her kind of framework. In the end, again, it was a sort of intimate and kind of emotional moment for me. I ended up giving her my umbrella because she was walking off into the rain without one. So it was this moment of sisterly bonding, which I kind of loved and had to put down on paper. Anyway, an entry into transness and rediscovering culture and myself as a person of color. This is when I started doing comics that were much more specific to who I was, right? So I started contributing. Actually, these are before I came out as trans, but I was contributing a lot to queer anthologies. So the first one is from The Other Side, which is an anthology of queer paranormal romance comics. The second one is Beyond Volume 2, which is an anthology of queer science fiction and fantasy comics. And meanwhile, I still don't quite know who I am. I'm sort of embracing or approaching embracing the idea of queerness, but not sure if I'm able to call myself that. And I think at this point, there were sort of things I started to realize about my own past that kind of came together to make me who I am, right? Images of divine femininity in my house. Being a Bengali, there are images of goddesses that I grew up with, and a lot of Bengalis, Hindus, grew up with, specifically of Bengali background, images of these fierce women who are not dependent, or, there's various interpretations, but these are the images I grew up with that eventually informed who I was, right? My mom was very devoted to Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge and learning and music and arts, and Durga also. And I think in addition to me trying to capture this lost connection to my parents, I think I was also absorbing and interpolating the sort of images of femininity that I grew up with in terms of their divinity, right? When I did finally come out as trans, I was invited to contribute to the first all-trans comics anthology called We're Still Here, which I had the privilege of doing the cover for, and I did a story within it. And finally, after many years of sort of trying to sell Apsara Engine and not quite knowing where I was with my life, I was freelancing in architecture, sort of in a spiral of in-betweenness. I think I finally came back, and this is, again, one more in a series of oscillations in my life where I'm going between displacement and grounding. Finally, in 2020, Spellbound came out, which was a sort of diary comic that then turned into a graphic novel about all the things I've been telling you about my journey through my family's history, my journey through architecture as a movement away from art, my movement back towards art, and my movement back towards being who I really am. It's a story of becoming trans, even though the conceit of the book is that it's being told through the eyes or through the representation of another character who is me, and both me and not me, who's a cisgendered woman, which is also problematic, but also was a way for me to reckon with my own transness at the time. So there's sort of, there's moments, quotidian moments of me working on my art, and then there's moments which look back to my adolescence, to my upbringing as a South Asian person and a person of color, and what that's like in the context of New York. I finally got, the reason I invented this character Anjali to represent me was because I didn't want to draw myself, and my editor finally convinced me to bring myself back into the book. So there's this like, multiple iterations of identity and representation that happen in the book, and I finally, in the last part of the book, I get to meet myself as Anjali, and we have this sort of like back and forth, this, multiple selves, like kind of fighting each other. And Apsara Engine, which was the book I was working on when I quit my job in architecture, finally also came out in 2020, and I think was the sort of moment of synthesis of all the things I've been talking about. A lot of the stories involve characters who are not explicitly queer because I didn't think I had access to that at the time. I wrote all the stories over a length of time, part of which was before I came out. So there's undercurrents of queerness which reflect my own kind of like reluctance to immerse myself in my queerness. But nevertheless, all the characters are femmes, or women, and are starting to inform me about who I am, even though I didn't quite know it at the time. And also, these are characters who I had never seen on a page, on the comics page before, right? So the impetus behind this story, Meena and Aparna, initially was just to see two South Asian women on the comics page, right? Something I'd never seen before. Just having a conversation, being friends, approaching, being lovers, but not quite getting there. Again, this is a reflection of my hesitancy at the time to embrace my own queerness. But that was really the spark that lit, some of these stories, like, who's going to draw South Asian women, if not me? And that was the only reason I started these stories. They ended up veering off into directions I could not have predicted, but that was the sort of heart of the story, right? Some of the stories involve the exoticization of South Asian people, and how in this one story called Pleasure Palace, there's an older South Asian woman who is being harangued by this white kid into like sort of letting him enter into her what he perceives as exotic, kind of orientalized vision of what he perceives as a sort of golden, magical place. And she sort of turns the tables on him and makes him the exotic within her own home. And finally, not finally, but like I think the moment of synthesis for me as a trans writer who had just come out was to write this story at the behest of feminist press. So this is the one most explicitly that deals with trans issues and all these issues that I'm talking about in terms of displacement and culture. This is a story called Swan Dive, which is about two South Asian trans people who come together and are discussing issues of belonging and home and culture as Asian Americans, right? And using cartography or drawing of maps as a vehicle for exploring what it means to be trans and reclaim a sense of essential transness or of essential culture through transness, right? So they start thinking about what it means for them to be South Asians, and there are these sort of cultural touchstones that I excavated from my own life. For example, things like these, vegetable markets, which I grew up visiting in Calcutta when I was growing up, that seemed to me quintessentially to have a moment of cultural specificity, which I've hung on to all my life. It's a very specific tradition that I thought couldn't belong to me as someone who lives here, but something I wanted to reclaim visually, which is why I put it on this page. And this is why the characters start imagining putting themselves into this world through the act of drawing. Eventually, the sort of, the panel, these sort of conventional panel structures in the beginning of the story give way in the end to a sort of phantasmagoric kaleidoscope of imagery in which they are fully immersed in this dream world, which they manifest, and it has become for them a kind of multiplicitous reality, right? There's time and space that is happening all at once, that they are making happen as through the act of drawing, which I think is a very queer strategy, in the sense that, like, when queer people do not find what they want in the real world, they make it happen just by dint of their imaginations. I'm thinking of things like, the ballroom scene that you all know through like shows like Pose, like that entire culture, this black culture, that black and brown culture that didn't exist before was made manifest by a queer black and brown imagination, which I think is just magical, and that's the kind of energy that I wanted to distill in these pages. What I want to just talk briefly about language, and something I only came to recently, and why I've been focusing a lot on, in my life, on this idea of migration, travel, displacement, and how that all comes together. I've been thinking a lot about the prefix trans, right? We all know that trans means, like, not just in terms of transgender, it also appears in many other words like transportation, right? And it means, like, the prefix is a movement across a border, right? Or a movement towards something, right? So something I realized fairly recently, and that you can call me out on whether or not this has any kind of basis in linguistic reality or not, but I was thinking a lot about the word, these words, Hajj, which, as you know, is the pilgrimage to Mecca that many Muslims undertake, or is part of the 5 things that you have to do as a Muslim, right? So it means, not only does it mean pilgrimage, but it also means to set out for a place. Another variation linguistically on that is the word hajja, which means to go, but it also means to repair, which seems to me very is potent as a double meaning, right? Finally, and you'll have to forgive my pronunciation here if I get it wrong, but hijira or hijaira, right? Which some of you know is a Joni Mitchell album, but is Muhammad, peace be unto him, his departure from Mecca to Medina, but also means flight, escape, or exodus, right? So it's a simultaneous escape from and coming to, which I think mirrors what I was saying before about the oscillation between displacement and home. Now, the moment for me where, things fell into place and was the moment of synthesis, was connecting these linguistic sounds and ideas to hijra, right? Which is one of many South Asian words for people for trans people, namely trans femmes. Not all trans femmes of South Asian descent claim the word hijra. Others use other words for themselves. Younger trans people don't claim it and just call themselves trans women. But there's a deep-seated ancient culture of mainly trans femmes who may or may not consider themselves to be third gender, but are certainly quite, femme in their identities. And this is one of the words that they use for themselves, hijra, right? Which has within it the idea of pilgrimage, of crossing a border, but also from hajja, to repair or to go towards a place of safety, right? And I found that so, such a moving movement for me, that all of these things kind of came together and made sense, and it seemed to me like this was meant to be, all these things in my life had conspired linguistically, culturally, in terms of gender to make me who I am, and it seemed a kind of magical confluence, right? Which brings me to what I'm working on now, and a project that I think encapsulates all of these movements, which is my third book, which I'm happy to say is going to be published by Abrams, Goddess knows when, but is basically, the conceit of it is that it's a travel book, but in the form of a graphic novel. So there's a guide who, this is a very dry run, the idea, this one-page comic that I did, a trans guide, travel guide, a person who's a travel guide, presenting to you a travel guide to an imaginary city, which has vaguely South Asian kind of cultural signifiers sort of mapped all over it, who is herself not from there and is therefore kind of a tourist, an outsider, discovering what it means for her to be part of this seeming trans utopia, right? This is a story I did for eFlux, and I can give you, if you just go to e-flux.com and look for my name, you can read this story in full. But this is a story I did called The Tourist, which was also, again, a sort of rehearsal for the book I'm working on, in which a trans woman goes back to where she's from as a tourist, falls in with a community, a commune of trans women, but is simultaneously accepted and rejected within that space, right? I think this moment of synthesis and recognition and reckoning for myself comes together in this book because the history of travel within my family, my dad having moved all over the place, not only to live but to work, he was always on the go. That was part of my inheritance and part of my life growing up. So there's things from that time in history and in life, travel documents to me that are very dear and as a genre have always been very dear to me and something I want to incorporate into my new book, right? The spaces, in between spaces like airports have always been very magical to me. And I'm only starting to realize why, right? It's, again, this oscillation between displacement and approaching home. And whether, there's a sense that, like, these in-between spaces, these spaces of movement are where I sometimes can feel most at home. So these are two sample pages from the book. They're probably going to change quite a bit when the final book comes out, but I think the things that I really wanted to address in this book are ideas about culture, race, and tradition, and through the lens of identity. What does it mean for trans people of a certain culture or background to have their own culture, right? Whenever I go to visit a new place, I'm always jealous of people who have traditions that I cannot participate in, right? So in this book, I'm trying to create a world where trans people create their own inherent traditions and find a sense of belonging within those traditions, right? What does that even look like? This is something that I'm trying to answer in the book. So I've been doing a lot of inventing of traditions that are very specific to people who are like me, what does that look like? I don't know yet, but I'm working on it. So I think what the book also is trying to acknowledge or deal with is this idea of home, right? Like I said, there are the in-between spaces, the movements that feel like home, but this, to me, also was the kind of home that I never got to participate in, except as a tiny little thing, right? There's these fleeting moments of home that came and went as a person who didn't live in India and was not immersed in a continuous experience of tradition and culture. And that, to me, is a very trans kind of story, right? It's like there's always this sense of movement and moving away from and moving towards, and it's always an oscillation. It's never a constant. It's never grounded. but at the same time, maybe the grounding is within that movement, right? So was this home, or is this home, like this sort of mishmash of subculture and aesthetics that I find myself in these days? I don't know. And I think one of the characters in Swan Dive encapsulates this idea when they say up there, I'll be watching some Bollywood movie from the 90s or something, and I'll feel like a wave of nostalgia for something I've never lived through, right? And that's kind of how, like, I feel like there are these moments that I want to capture and make part of a history of stability for myself, but I don't think I will ever get there. And I think that is part of my inheritance. And I'm not complaining about it, I'm just saying it seems like a very interesting space of movement, right? And I'm thankful that that's something I can explore through comics, which has been possibly the closest thing I can call a space of home, right? That I've always come back to comics as a language, a visual language that I've used to find grounding in myself. So thanks, Mom and Dad, for that, right? And also thanks for all the, for giving me all the sort of like touchstones that I needed, and for making me trans, because y'all did it for me. This is the question of inheritance and of how that shapes who we are. Thank you so much.
Any questions as you want until 3:15. We'll go 15 minutes.
Hit me.
I actually have a question. Now that I've got the microphone, I'm gonna use it. Well, it's both a question and a comment. First of all, it was so inspiring. I love hearing you. And you're talking about moving. I was talking about itineraries before, about imagining a space. Was the map of trans people or of a community that doesn't find a place in the present day, let's say. But what about labyrinths? And when I see your pages, what I see is labyrinths, and one of the most powerful thing about them, and is that, well, the origin of labyrinths. I'm obsessed with labyrinths. They were created to protect. And it seems that your characters are constantly like walking them, and at the same time, those are the places where they find protection. The labyrinths were created to, first of all, in the pyramids, to protect the treasure, to protect the tombs of the pharaohs. And then later they were used in other areas to protect castles, to protect sacred places, etc. So I think that there's also that very powerful symbolism in your work. That's my reflection. Second, what about the hybrid creatures? That little like creature that flies, but that is also kind of like a little pet, but is dangerous. Yeah, just that.
I actually, that's interesting. I never really thought about the labyrinth within the work, and I wonder whether, there's a sense that of trying to solve the labyrinth, like getting to understand or decode the path of the labyrinth, but then where does it get you, right? Like, does it get you to home? Because there maybe is no home, right? And that's something I'm always talking about in the work, like this sort of popping in and out of ideas of center and of home, right? So maybe the path of the labyrinth in itself is the home, right? Like it just maybe doesn't stop. It just doesn't. It never ends up getting somewhere, which is, I think, something I think the third book is going to deal with, right? The sort of fleetingness of this idea of utopia, whether it can exist at all. And I think that's something the book is going to try and articulate, is like these trans people, these like South Asian trans people have created a utopia, but is it real? Or is it all in like, is it an illusion? Is it like, can it even exist? Maybe it's just all a path, and it's like an endless path, right? As for hybrids, I think this is also something like that was part of my imagination that maybe I should have listened to much earlier on in my life. Like, I had images of like, you know, I'm thinking about Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the second one, with Donald Sutherland and thingy. And there's a horrifying scene, you know what I'm talking about, with a dog with the, and this is something I was just like, whoa, you know, there's something so visceral and emotionally jarring about that moment that I think it inserted itself into my head, and I dreamt about these hybrid creatures that, this is where that, you know, two of the stories in Apsara Engine came from, is this idea of hybridity, right? I wanted to investigate why that was horrifying to me, but also why, like, maybe I wanted to embrace it as a sort of genre. And so I think the book in itself is trying to do that. It's like escaping genre and being a hybrid genre, and the sort of scary space that maps out for you. And I think the third book is also doing the same thing, right? It's like, it's in between a travel guide and a travel program and a graphic novel, and it's neither fish nor fowl. It's like all of these things, and the messiness of that is part of the sort of investigation of the book.
Thank you so much for that, and I'm so excited about the new book. And I want to follow up on that, and I was really interested to hear you say, well, maybe it's in their head, or maybe it's fantasy, and I sort of went, oh, like I sort of, having talked about science fiction and fantasy, sometimes the pleasure of comics, you're like, it's on the page, so we should understand it sometimes as real, right?
Uh-huh.
Like that. So I guess I was sort of curious, following some conversations we've been having over the last day or so about, you know, the tension between an imagined future or an imagined present, or maybe a multiverse. You sort of started to answer, you answered it somewhat in the first answer, but I'm sort of curious again how you're sort of conceptualizing it as a space in relationship to, it's outside of genre, but maybe it's a new genre that you're doing, right? And I was also curious, in terms of questions of linearity in a guide, and it's this ideal space for trans people, and thinking about the idea, is it a space that transitioning has always already happened? Is like the ideal space where dead names don't exist, where previous, like I'm sort of curious about both the practice and imagining of that and the ethics of that, like about what this ideal space is, that people have already arrived, or there are also people who are transitioning, and how you configure that.
That's something I'm contending with right now, right? Like having invented or put forward this conceit of a trans utopia, and what it means to be exclusively trans. How do you manage the mechanics of it and the infrastructure of it? Like, what are the politics of it and the politics of exclusion or inclusion within that, right? So I was just writing about, and it's a very thorny subject, right? Like, the trans guide is interviewing a sort of elder within the community, and she's like, what happens to, you know, the children that are born here who turn out to be cis? And they're like, oh, you know, we eventually sort of encourage them to go away. And I'm like, yikes, do I really want to write that? Or is that okay, right? So I'm still working on that idea. As far as like the idea of, we were just talking about this at lunch, right? About like Black Panther, and how, Stacey, you were talking about the power of Black Panther being grounded in the present, right? And how that's like, it's not, I mean, it is speculative, but it's also not, the power of it not being just a sort of vision of the future, but being grounded in the present, right? The possibilities that arise from that groundedness in reality. And so that's something also that I wanted to explore in this book, right? And this is maybe why I wanted it to be a travel guide and not science fiction, is because I wanted it to be like a sort of given and not to be a fantasy, right? And then, but also to investigate the messiness of that reality and whether such a thing is even possible. Having said that, I'm jonesing to just do science fiction. I want to say straight up science fiction, but that's not the right term. But you know what I'm talking about, queer up science. Yeah, I really do want to, I want to like do a space opera at some point, but goddess knows if that'll ever happen. But, I find myself immersing myself in genre and then just not being able to hang on to it. It's sort of like, it's very slippery. So I just sort of like, it sort of, goes out, the stories go off into their own world that again, either resist genre or just cannot find a foothold within genre. That's okay, I think,
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. And I was really moved by how you're talking about the idea of belonging to a place or a community. But as you're kind of guiding us through your works, you were also coming back to this idea of what kind of stories belong to you, too. And so there's another kind of looking at this idea of belonging from this other perspective, but what you can take ownership of, or what is maybe what there's authenticity enough to be able to take hold of that story and tell it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more just about that relationship between creating a comic or comics through, you're writing the narrative and drawing the images, and you're producing that story. And at what point do you get a sense of owning or ownership of that story or the identity that you're?
I don't think I never have felt that sense of ownership. Honestly, like the world of Swan Dive is as fleeting as reading the story itself, right? You read it and then it's never fixed or stable. It's like some of it stays with you. I'm not trying to big up the like ethereal nature of it. It's just that's the nature of the story, right? Like you can't inhabit it as a place. It's a story that you can dip into and then you're out of it again. I don't know, maybe with this next book, because it's more grounded in specific details of what makes culture, or, what is racially or ethnically or genderly specific about this place. Maybe I'll feel, because it's being presented as a guide, maybe it'll be more fixed, but I kind of think it also won't be, because I think built into the work is this idea that even the attempt to write such a book is in itself sort of slippery, right? Because I think inevitably as a travel guide it's going to fail, because it's not a travel guide, it's a graphic novel. So the very attempt is going to be on a shaky foundation, and I don't think that lends itself to this idea of ownership in the same way that I don't know, like Tolkien might have taken the map of Middle Earth as something that is just grounded and fixed and is like you can inhabit it in a certain way. I mean, I love that, and that's what this book is approximating or approaching. But in the same way that I can never claim for myself traditions or culture because of my background as a migratory person, I was going to say bird, but person, and part of which is my family inheritance, I don't think I'll ever be able to do that, right? Like, and I think this was something I was doing as a child, was like drawing maps of places that didn't exist because I wanted to claim ownership or live in those spaces, and it's just, But in the end, it's like, yeah, you can claim ownership of your imagination, but of a place, that's harder, and the book is about that struggle to never approach a sense of control, or trying to approach that sense of control and failing.
Hola.
Voila.
I think you have sort of already started answering this question, and we've asked you a lot about your new book already. But I wanted to ask you about your creative process for it, and I was specifically thinking about how do you approach to this idea of like trans or queer architecture, and how do you think about, like, you know, the places? How do you think about, well, I don't know how the book is going to be, but like, how do you imagine this city being built? Like, what kind of monuments, and like, when it, like, you know, like tourist attractions, institutions, roads, like way people communicate, and like, how do you create this space from?
Oh my gosh.
Physical, maybe it's too much. I mean,
No.
I'm
These
very interested
these
in
are
this.
exactly the kinds of questions that I'm contending with, right? Like, this is the kind of space that I really love drawing and creating as a world. Like, and it sort of dips in and out of fantasy, right? But I love the idea of like a hybrid space, again, between landscape, architecture, cartography, urban spaces, and the body, right? So it's like this kind of shifting sense of scale and pattern and volume and flatness and line and all these things happening at once. This is my fantasy happy place, right? But for the book, this question of like what makes this place specifically trans and or a utopia has been very thorny for me, because I think, and part of it has to do with my rejection of my architectural past, right? So when you say monument, right, I was starting to write a chapter in which there is a monument, and then I was like, no, I can't do that, because it seems like the anti-monument is what I need, right? So in fact, there's a monument in the space that is taken over by the trans populace and reimagined. So they're not it's not like they're building more stuff. It's rather that they're taking these spaces and reinventing, reimagining them. Because I think, to some degree, you know, architecture and construction is violence, right? So I wanted to posit a new way of imagining, I don't want to use the word colonize, but to reclaim the idea of colonization for brown people, trans people, and to imagine that the new architectures can be recolonizing these spaces that were formerly monuments and or, you know, sort of memorials to a sort of glory and narcissism that then is turned on its head and made sort of flattened and more communal, right? But maybe that is also going to fail within the book, right? I don't know yet. And it's, you know, this idea of how utopic that idea is and whether it's even possible. So yeah, even as much as I want to do this kind of like visual indulgence, within the book I'm trying to think of another way to reimagine what a trans architecture or trans urbanism can look like. I mean, there's an inherent sort of socialist thrust to this utopia, and I wanted to see how they might imagine how architecture is part of that kind of project of socialism. Whether or not it works, you know, I don't know yet.
Okay. I think that even though we all have many questions and many things to comment with Bishakh, we're going to stop here. We're going to take like 15 minutes or 10 minutes break, and we'll come back for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.